The elk carcass had been dead for 3 days. In the scorching July heat of the Rocky Mountains, that meant one thing: the meat was going bad. Thomas Mackenzie could smell it before he even reached the cache his trapping party had built near the Green River. The stench hit him like a wall, and he knew without looking that they'd lost close to 200 pounds of prime elk meat. It was 1827, and Mackenzie's brigade of 12 trappers had been working the mountain streams for beaver pelts since early spring. They were weeks away from the summer rendezvous, where they'd trade their furs and resupply. But now they faced a problem that had plagued mountain men since the first trappers ventured into these mountains: how to keep meat from spoiling in the brutal summer heat. "That's the 3rd cache we've lost this month," said William Carson, Mackenzie's second in command, covering his nose as they approached the rotting carcass. "We're going to starve before we reach rendezvous if this keeps up." The mathematics of survival in the Rockies were brutal and simple. A grown man working the trap lines, wading through freezing streams, hiking steep terrain with heavy packs, needed between 4,000 and 6,000 calories per day. That meant roughly 6 to 10 pounds of meat daily. Fresh buffalo, elk, or deer were plentiful enough in spring and fall, but summer presented unique challenges. The animals were lean, scattered across vast territories, and the meat went bad within hours of butchering in the heat. Mountain men had known about the problem since the first trappers entered these mountains in the early 1800s. They'd tried every preservation method they knew: smoking, salting, making jerky, rendering fat for pemmican. These techniques worked well enough, but they required time, materials, and specific conditions. You needed salt, which was expensive and heavy to transport. You needed dry weather for making jerky, but summer thunderstorms swept through the mountains regularly. You needed time to smoke meat properly, but trappers were constantly moving, following the beaver streams. Most critically, these methods changed the nature of the meat. Jerky and pemmican were valuable trail foods, dense with calories and easily portable. But they weren't fresh meat. After months in the mountains eating dried and preserved food, a trapper craved fresh beef tender, juicy, cooked over an open fire. It wasn't just about taste or morale. Fresh meat provided nutrients that preserved foods couldn't match, helping prevent the weakness and joint pain that plagued men who ate only dried provisions. The real problem was this: in July and August, when temperatures in the lower valleys soared above 90 degrees, fresh meat lasted less than 2 days before bacteria turned it rancid. Even in the relative coolness of the mountain camps at 7,000 or 8,000 feet elevation, meat rarely stayed good longer than 3 days. And when your hunting party brought down a 700-pound elk, you couldn't eat it all in 3 days. Not with 12 men, not even with 20. So the meat rotted. Trappers watched hundreds of pounds of valuable protein turn to maggot-infested waste, while they gnawed on pemmican and wished for fresh steak. Some tried burying meat in streams, but the water wasn't cold enough in summer to prevent spoilage. Others hung carcasses in trees, hoping the mountain breeze would keep them cool, but flies found them within hours, and the summer sun beat down mercilessly, even at altitude. The waste frustrated everyone. Native peoples in the region had lived here for thousands of years. Surely they'd solve this problem. Mackenzie had asked his Shoshone wife's relatives about it the previous winter. They told him that in the old days, before they had horses and could move quickly to follow game, they'd use different techniques depending on the season. But when pressed about summer meat storage, they just shrugged and said they didn't store much meat in summer. They hunted smaller game more frequently, ate what they caught quickly, and moved often. That wasn't an option for a trapping brigade. They needed to stay in areas rich with beaver for weeks at a time, moving only when they'd worked out a section of streams. Sending hunters out daily for fresh game wasted time and manpower needed for trapping. The brigade needed a way to store large quantities of meat safely through the hottest months. On that July afternoon in 1827, standing over the rotted elk carcass, Thomas Mackenzie decided he'd had enough of wasting food and watching his men's health decline on a diet of dried meat and wild onions. There had to be an answer, and he was determined to find it. What Mackenzie discovered over the following weeks would revolutionize how trappers operated in the high mountains. More than that, it would demonstrate a principle of natural refrigeration that native peoples had understood for millennia, but that most trappers had overlooked in their rush to exploit the region's fur-bearing animals. The solution wasn't in some new preservation technique or imported technology. It was right there in the mountains themselves, hidden in plain sight above the timberline. But first, Mackenzie had to see past the obvious and recognize what the mountains were trying to show him. 3 days after losing the elk meat, Mackenzie's brigade was camped at 9,000 feet, high enough that the nights dropped below freezing even in July. The men were finishing their evening meal boiled pemmican mixed with wild turnips, a monotonous but nutritious stew, when one of the younger trappers, a fellow named Jake Bridger, mentioned something he'd seen that afternoon. "I was checking that line of traps up on the high creek," Bridger said, "and I came across the strangest thing. There's a little valley up there, maybe 11,000 feet, tucked between two peaks. And right in the middle of this valley, in the middle of July, mind you, there's a field of snow and ice. Not just a patch. A whole field, must be 200 yards across." The men around the fire nodded. Permanent snow fields weren't unusual above 11,000 feet in the Rockies. Many peaks held snow year-round, and the highest valleys often retained patches of winter's accumulation through summer. Mackenzie had seen dozens of them himself. "That's not the strange part," Bridger continued. "The strange part is there's a cave entrance at one end of the snowfield, and cold air's pouring out of it. I mean colder than any stream water, colder than night air. I put my hand in front of it, and it felt like January." Now Mackenzie's attention sharpened. A cave that breathed cold air in summer. He'd heard stories of such places. The Flathead people called them spirit caves, places where winter lived year-round. He'd always dismissed them as legend, the kind of tale you heard around rendezvous when men were drunk on trade whiskey and competing to tell the most outlandish story. "How far?" Mackenzie asked. "Maybe 4 miles from here, but it's a hard climb. Steep talus slopes and loose rock." Mackenzie thought about it. 4 miles wasn't far, but with elevation gain and rough terrain, it would take several hours to reach. Time they should spend trapping. But something about Bridger's description nagged at him. A cave that stayed frozen in summer. If such a thing really existed. "We'll go up tomorrow," Mackenzie said. "First light. You, me, and Carson." The men exchanged glances. Their leader wasn't known for chasing wild stories. But Mackenzie's mind was already working through possibilities. Natural cold storage. If the cave was as cold as Bridger claimed, and if that cold was reliable. The next morning, the 3 men climbed through the pre-dawn darkness, reaching the tree line as the sun broke over the eastern peaks. The forest gave way to alpine meadows dotted with wildflowers, columbine, paintbrush, alpine forget-me-nots. Above the meadows lay the rock, vast fields of broken stone that had tumbled from the peaks over thousands of years. They climbed for 3 hours, picking their way across the talus until they crested a ridge and looked down into a high valley. Just as Bridger had described, a field of snow and ice filled the valley floor, gleaming white against the gray rock. The snowfield was enormous, at least 200 yards across and twice that long, nestled in a natural depression between 3 peaks. "There," Bridger pointed to the far end of the valley, "the cave entrance." They descended carefully. The temperature dropped noticeably as they approached the snowfield. By the time they reached the edge of the ice, Mackenzie could see his breath in the mid-morning sun. And the cold was just the beginning. The cave entrance was a crack in the rock face, perhaps 6 feet high and 3 feet wide. Snow and ice formed a ramp leading down into darkness. But the most remarkable thing was the wind. Cold air flowed from the cave opening in a steady stream, so cold it raised goosebumps on Mackenzie's arms despite the July sunshine. Carson held his hand in the flow of air and then jerked it back. "That's got to be below freezing. How is that possible?" Mackenzie didn't answer. He was too busy thinking. He'd spent his childhood on a farm in Pennsylvania, where his father had built an ice house, a stone structure half buried in the ground where winter ice was stored for summer use. The ice house worked because cold air sank and the thick stone walls provided insulation. The ice would last through September if they'd harvested enough in winter and packed it properly. This cave was like a natural ice house, but on a scale no man could build. The peaks above them rose to 13,000 feet. Snow accumulated there all winter, compressing into dense ice. That ice filtered down into cracks and fissures, creating underground chambers. The chambers stayed frozen because cold air, being heavier than warm air, sank and settled into the lowest spaces. In winter, brutally cold air would pour into these spaces, freezing everything solid. In summer, the ice remained because the rock provided perfect insulation, and the cave's depth kept it from direct sunlight. "We're going in," Mackenzie said. Carson looked at him like he was mad. "Tom, we didn't bring torches. We don't know how deep it goes, and if we get lost in there—" "We're not going deep, just far enough to see what's inside." Mackenzie pulled out his tinderbox and lit a pine-pitch torch he'd brought for this possibility. The flame flickered in the cave's exhaled breath, but held steady. Taking a deep breath, he stepped into the opening. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in as many steps. The cave floor angled downward, following the crack in the rock. Ice formations clung to the walls, stalactites of frozen water, sheets of ice coating the stone. After about 50 feet, the passage opened into a chamber perhaps 30 feet across, and the chamber was full of ice, not snow, but solid, clear ice, layered and compacted from years of accumulation. The walls glistened with frost. The air was so cold it burned Mackenzie's lungs when he breathed deeply. He stood there in the torch's flickering light, looking at tons upon tons of ice that would never melt, and he understood immediately what he'd found. A natural ice box, a refrigerator carved by geology and maintained by physics, a place where meat could be stored indefinitely, protected from heat, insects, and decay. "Gentlemen," Mackenzie said, his breath steaming in the torchlight, "we just solved our summer meat problem." Getting the elk meat up to the ice cave was backbreaking work. It took Mackenzie's entire brigade 2 days to quarter a freshly killed elk, wrap the quarters in canvas, and pack them 4 miles up the mountain. The men grumbled the entire time, convinced their leader had lost his mind. "This is madness, Tom," one trapper said, as they struggled up a steep talus slope with 80 pounds of meat on their backs. "We're hauling fresh meat to a cave we can't even camp near because it's too high and too cold. How are we supposed to cook this meat when we need it? Haul it back down every time we want supper?" Mackenzie had thought about that problem. The answer was simple. They wouldn't cook meat from the cave regularly. This was emergency storage, meat preserved for when hunting was poor or they needed to stay put for extended trapping. Or meat saved for the long journey to rendezvous, where fresh provisions would make them the envy of every brigade there. But he understood the men's skepticism. What he was asking them to do had never been done before, at least not by American trappers. He was asking them to trust that this cave, this impossible frozen chamber in the middle of summer, would preserve their food better than any method they knew. When they finally got the elk quarters into the cave chamber, Carson helped Mackenzie pack them deep in the back, where the ice was thickest. They wrapped each quarter separately, labeled them with charcoal on the canvas, and noted the date, July 28, 1827. "Now what?" Bridger asked. "Now we go back down, keep trapping, and come back in 2 weeks," Mackenzie said. 2 weeks. In normal summer conditions, elk meat went bad in less than 3 days. If this worked, if the meat was still good in 2 weeks, it would prove the cave's potential. If it failed, well, they'd only wasted 1 elk and some climbing time. They descended back to their regular camp at 9,000 feet and resumed their trapping routine. The days settled into familiar patterns, checking trap lines in the pre-dawn cold, skinning beaver in the afternoon heat, stretching pelts on willow frames, moving camp every few days to fresh territory. The men stopped talking about the meat in the cave. Most of them had forgotten about it by the 3rd day, written it off as one of those experiments that didn't pan out. But Mackenzie hadn't forgotten. He counted the days, checking the calendar he marked on a piece of bark. 2 weeks felt like 2 months. He tried not to show his anxiety to the men, but Carson noticed. "You're worried it won't work," Carson said one evening as they sat by the fire. "I'm worried it will work," Mackenzie replied, "because if it does, everything changes." Carson didn't understand what he meant, not yet. But Mackenzie had spent those 2 weeks thinking through the implications. If meat could be stored safely at high altitude through summer, brigades could hunt more efficiently, taking larger game when the opportunity presented, storing the surplus, never worrying about waste. They could establish high camps near ice caves and operate from those bases for months at a time. They could arrive at rendezvous with fresh meat to trade, a commodity worth its weight in beaver pelts. More than that, this discovery would change how trappers thought about the mountains themselves. Most men saw the high peaks as obstacles, barriers between the beaver-rich valleys. But if those same peaks contained natural refrigeration, they became assets. A brigade that understood and exploited this resource would have an enormous advantage over competitors. On August 11th, exactly 2 weeks after storing the elk, Mackenzie led his men back up the mountain. None of them spoke much during the climb. They were all thinking the same thing. In a few hours, they'd know if their leader was a genius or a fool. They reached the cave entrance in late morning. The cold air still streamed from the opening, unchanged. Mackenzie lit his torch and led the way in, the men following close behind. The chamber looked exactly as they'd left it, walls of ice, frozen floor, crystals of frost catching the torchlight. The meat was in the back where they'd placed it. Mackenzie unwrapped the first quarter and examined it carefully by torchlight. The surface was frozen solid, covered with a thin layer of frost. No smell of decay, no discoloration. He scraped the frost away, revealing the meat beneath. It looked as fresh as the day they'd killed the elk. The color was right deep red, not the gray-brown of spoiled meat. The texture was firm. Most tellingly, there was no odor except the clean, cold smell of the cave itself. "Well, I'll be," one of the trappers muttered. Mackenzie pulled out his knife and cut a slice from the quarter. The blade sliced through easily. The meat wasn't frozen solid, just kept at that perfect temperature just above freezing where nothing could rot, but nothing would freeze hard enough to damage the tissue. He passed the slice around. Every man examined it, smelled it, checked the color. Every man reached the same conclusion. "It's perfect," Carson said. 2 weeks in July, and it's perfect. But Mackenzie wasn't satisfied with a visual inspection. That evening, back at their lower camp, they thawed one of the smaller pieces and cooked it over the fire. If the meat had begun to spoil, even microscopically, cooking would reveal it in the taste and smell. The elk roasted slowly on green willow spits, fat sizzling and dripping into the coals. When it was done, Mackenzie cut a piece and chewed it carefully, paying attention to every aspect, texture, flavor, any hint of off-taste that would indicate the start of decay. It was perfect. Better than perfect, actually. The cold storage seemed to have tenderized the meat slightly, making it more flavorful than elk usually tasted. The men devoured their portions and asked for more. "Tom," Carson said, gnawing the last meat from a bone, "you just changed everything." Word of Mackenzie's ice cave discovery spread slowly through the trapping community, carried by the gossip networks that connected brigades across the Rockies. At the 1828 rendezvous at Bear Lake, Mackenzie's men told the story to anyone who would listen, how they'd stored elk meat in a frozen cave for 2 weeks in July, how it came out as fresh as the day they'd killed it, how they'd used the cave all through the summer to store meat and never went hungry. Some listeners believed them, others dismissed it as another tall tale, the kind of exaggerated story trappers love to tell. After all, frozen caves in summer? Ice that never melted, even in July? It sounded like something from a dream, or a lie told to impress greenhorns. But the men who'd been there, who'd seen it with their own eyes, knew it was true. And more importantly, they understood its value. By the fall of 1828, several brigades had fanned out through the high country, specifically looking for similar caves. They found them not everywhere, but in enough places to matter. Ice Mountain in what would become West Virginia, the Pryor Mountain ice caves in Montana, natural ice formations in the Wind River Range, the Uintas, the Absarokas. These discoveries were kept quiet at first. A brigade that knew where the ice caves were had a competitive advantage. They could venture into territory others avoided, stay in the field longer, trade fresh meat at rendezvous for premium prices. Knowledge of ice cave locations became valuable intelligence, passed only between trusted friends or sold for good money. But by 1830 the secret was out. Every experienced mountain man working the Rockies knew about high-altitude cold storage. The technique became standard practice for summer brigades operating above 9,000 feet. The process was simple. Find a cave or chamber at high elevation where ice persisted year-round. Pack meat deep where the temperature stayed coldest, mark the cache location carefully, and retrieve as needed. The impact on trapping operations was immediate and substantial. Brigades could now take large game efficiently. A 700-pound elk could feed a dozen men for a month if properly stored, rather than 3 days before it rotted. Men ate better, stayed healthier, worked more efficiently. Fewer days were wasted on constant hunting, freeing time for trapping. Mortality from starvation, which had claimed numerous trappers in lean seasons, dropped significantly. The technique wasn't without challenges and risks. The caves were always at high altitude, often requiring hours of difficult climbing to reach. Packing meat up talus slopes was exhausting work. Weather could turn deadly fast in the high country. Summer thunderstorms brought lightning strikes, sudden snowfall, and temperature drops that caught unwary men exposed above tree line. More than one trapper died retrieving meat from high caches, victims of falls on steep terrain or exposure when storms trapped them far from lower camps. There was also the learning curve of understanding how the caves worked. Not every high-altitude cave stayed frozen. Some experienced seasonal thaws despite their elevation. Others had poor air circulation, leading to ice sublimation that ruined cached meat. Trappers learned through trial and error which caves were reliable and which weren't. The best caves had certain characteristics: northern exposures, good airflow, large ice masses, and stable temperatures even during hot spells. Jim Bridger, who'd been present for Mackenzie's original experiment, became something of an expert on ice cave storage during his decades in the mountains. He developed a set of guidelines that other trappers followed. Store meat at least 50 feet from cave entrances where temperature fluctuations were greatest. Wrap everything in canvas or leather to prevent frost damage. Never store meat in the same chamber where you stored previous caches without checking for contamination. Mark every cache with the date and contents. Most importantly, verify that the cave stayed below 40 degrees, even during the hottest August days. Anything warmer risked spoilage. The science behind why the caves worked wasn't understood in modern terms, but trappers developed an intuitive grasp of the principles. They knew cold air sank, so the deepest chambers stayed coldest. They knew ice took enormous amounts of heat to melt, so large ice masses acted as cold batteries, maintaining freezing temperatures even when surface conditions warmed. They knew that rock provided insulation, preventing external heat from penetrating into the depths. They didn't use words like thermal mass or heat capacity, but they understood the concepts through experience. Native peoples, watching these white trappers discover ice caves they'd known about for generations, must have found it amusing. The Shoshone, Flathead, Crow, and other tribes had used high-altitude ice sources for various purposes for centuries. They collected ice in summer for medicine, to treat fevers and injuries. They used the cold chambers to store medicinal plants that lost potency in heat. Some groups stored ceremonial items that required cool, dry conditions. The caves were known, respected, and used, just not for the same purpose the trappers employed them. The difference was one of scale and necessity. Native hunting practices, particularly after horses arrived on the plains, focused on buffalo and involved large groups that could process and consume or distribute meat quickly. The traditional preservation methods making pemmican, drying meat into jerky, smoking were highly developed and worked well for their needs. They didn't need to store large amounts of fresh meat at high altitude because their social and economic systems handled meat distribution differently. But for small trapping brigades, often just a dozen men operating independently far from any community, The ice caves solved a critical problem, and Mackenzie's discovery didn't just benefit trappers. Settlers traveling the Oregon Trail learned that certain mountain passes offered access to permanent ice fields where they could cool butter, store eggs, and keep meat fresh during the long journey west. Prospectors working gold claims in the high country used ice caves to preserve food during summer months when heat made normal storage impossible. Army expeditions exploring and mapping the Rockies relied on high-altitude caches to extend their range and reduce dependence on regular resupply. By 1840, when the beaver trade was collapsing and mountain men were transitioning to other occupations, the knowledge of high-altitude cold storage had become part of the common wisdom of the American West. It appeared in trail guides, military reports, and settlers' diaries. Above 11,000 feet, seek ice caves for natural refrigeration became standard advice in documents like Randolph Marcy's The Prairie Traveler, the definitive guidebook for Western emigrants, published in 1859. The technique continued to be used through the 19th century. Montana miners in the 1860s established ice harvesting operations in the high country, cutting ice from permanent snowfields and packing it down to mining camps, where it sold for premium prices. Colorado ranchers in the 1870s stored beef in high mountain caves during summer, allowing them to supply fresh meat to Denver restaurants year-round. Even into the early 20th century, before mechanical refrigeration became widespread and affordable, some remote mountain communities relied on natural ice caves for food preservation. Thomas Mackenzie never became famous. Unlike Bridger, Kit Carson, or Jedediah Smith, his name didn't appear in history books or get attached to mountains and rivers. He died in 1843, killed by a grizzly bear while trapping in what would become Idaho. The men who knew him said he was a good leader, fair trader, and skilled woodsman who understood the mountains better than most. The ice cave discovery was just one of many innovations he introduced during his years in the fur trade innovations that helped men survive and succeed in one of the harshest environments on the continent. But his contribution mattered. In the larger story of American expansion into the West, small innovations like high-altitude meat storage played crucial roles. They allowed small groups to operate in remote areas for extended periods, increasing the pace of exploration and exploitation. They reduced mortality from starvation and malnutrition, keeping experienced men in the field rather than in early graves. They demonstrated that success in the wilderness came not just from strength and courage, but from observation, adaptation, and understanding natural systems. The lesson applies beyond meat storage. The trappers and settlers who succeeded in the West were those who looked at the land not as an enemy to conquer, but as a system to understand and work within. They observed how native peoples used resources, learned which plants were edible and which poisonous, noted which animals indicated water sources, recognized weather signs in cloud formations and wind patterns. They adapted their methods and expectations to match reality rather than trying to force reality to match their preconceptions. Mackenzie's ice cave discovery exemplified this approach. He faced a problem meat spoiling in summer heat. Rather than trying harder with existing preservation methods or simply accepting the waste as inevitable, he remained open to new solutions. When he heard about the frozen cave, he investigated personally rather than dismissing it as impossible. When the investigation confirmed the cave's potential, he experimented systematically, testing the concept before committing fully. When the test succeeded, he shared the knowledge with others rather than hoarding it for competitive advantage. This combination of observation, experimentation, adaptation, and knowledge sharing characterized the best of the mountain men. They were practical scientists, testing hypotheses in the laboratory of the wilderness, sharing results through an informal network that connected men across thousands of miles of mountains and plains. Their findings, which hot springs to avoid, which passes, stayed open latest in fall, where beaver were most plentiful, which tribes were friendly, and yes, where ice caves provided natural refrigeration, constituted a body of environmental knowledge that made Western settlement possible. Modern historians sometimes romanticize the mountain men, turning them into symbols of American individualism and self-reliance. But the real story is more complex and more interesting. Men like Mackenzie succeeded not through rugged individualism, but through community knowledge, shared wisdom, and practical cooperation. They survived not by conquering nature, but by understanding it well enough to work with, rather than against its patterns and systems. The ice caves themselves still exist, of course. Many are now protected as natural landmarks, visited by tourists who marvel at ice persisting in summer heat. The Ice Mountain Preserve in West Virginia, designated a National Natural Landmark in 2012, maintains ice year-round at elevations as low as 2,200 feet through the same natural refrigeration process trappers used 200 years ago. The Pryor Mountain Ice Caves in Montana, the ice caves of New Mexico, the alpine ice fields of Colorado, all continue functioning as they have for millennia. Natural refrigerators carved by geology and maintained by physics. Scientists now understand exactly why these formations persist. Cold winter air, denser than warm air, sinks into talus slopes and fractures in rock. This cold air freezes water in the rock, creating ice masses. In summer, the surrounding rock acts as insulation, preventing external heat from reaching the ice. The ice itself has enormous thermal mass. Melting 1 pound of ice requires the same energy as heating 1 pound of water by 144 degrees Fahrenheit. So even if some warm air reaches the ice, it can melt only a tiny amount before losing all its heat. The process is self-stabilizing. As long as enough ice remains from winter to last through summer, the system perpetuates itself year after year. But understanding the science doesn't diminish the achievement of men like Mackenzie, who figured out how to use these natural systems for practical purposes. In 1827, there was no established body of scientific knowledge about thermal dynamics, heat transfer, or natural refrigeration. There were just observations, experiments, and practical applications derived from trial and error. The ice cave discovery represents one small chapter in the larger story of how Europeans and their descendants learned to live in North America. It's a story that includes many shameful episodes, displacement of native peoples, environmental destruction, cultural genocide. But it also includes moments of genuine ingenuity, adaptation, and learning. The trappers who learned to use ice caves weren't conquering the wilderness. They were learning from it, discovering what native peoples had known for generations and finding new applications for ancient knowledge. In our modern age of mechanical refrigeration, the idea of hiking 4 miles up a mountain to store meat in a cave seems absurd. We open our refrigerators without thinking about the miracle of cold storage, take ice from machines without considering how recently such technology was developed. But for men like Thomas Mackenzie, working in mountains where summer heat could mean starvation, finding that frozen cave must have felt like discovering gold. The ice caves remind us that innovation doesn't always mean creating something new. Sometimes it means recognizing what's already there, seeing potential where others saw only obstacles, understanding natural systems well enough to work within them rather than against them. Mackenzie didn't invent refrigeration. The mountains did that millions of years ago. He just had the wit to recognize it and the courage to test whether it could be used. That wit and courage, more than any single innovation or discovery, characterized the men who opened the American West. They observed, they experimented, they adapted, they shared what they learned. Some of them, like Jim Bridger, became famous. Others, like Thomas Mackenzie, were forgotten by history. But all of them contributed to the accumulated knowledge that made settlement of the Western mountains possible. The next time you open your refrigerator for a cold drink or fresh meat, spare a thought for the trappers who, 200 years ago, hauled elk quarters up mountainsides in the July heat, betting their survival on frozen caves they barely understood. They were solving the same problem you solve effortlessly every day: how to keep food fresh through summer's heat. They just solved it with observation, ingenuity, and 10 pounds of meat on their backs as they climbed toward the snow line. That's the real story of the American frontier, not conquest, but adaptation. Not taming the wilderness, but learning to live in it. Not ignoring what nature offered, but recognizing it, testing it, and using it to survive. Thomas Mackenzie's impossible trick storing meat, fresh in summer heat, was only impossible until someone looked at the mountains and saw not just obstacles, but opportunity. That shift in perspective, more than any particular technique or technology, opened the West to settlement and changed American history. The ice caves endure, still cold, still frozen, still demonstrating that sometimes the best solutions to our problems have been there all along, waiting for someone clever enough to recognize them.